Nearly 2 months after mass anti-government demonstrations led to the overthrow of Sudan's longtime president, Omar al-Bashir, a mostly peaceful political transition has turned violent. This past Monday, soldiers taking orders from the military regime that now rules Sudan opened fire on protesters, killing more than 100 people. The exact body count remains unknown, and that is by design. The junta imposed a communications blackout, blocking access to social media, disrupting phone traffic, severely restricting the news and information flow. Over the past few weeks, many foreign journalists, including those from Al Jazeera, have had their licenses revoked, their offices raided, meaning that stories of alleged mass murder and rape at the hands of the security services do not make it beyond Sudan's borders. When the generals took power, they promised new media freedoms, space for independent reporting. However, their tolerance for those telling the stories of this revolution has run out, and they're using tactics straight out of Omar al-Bashir's playbook. Our starting point this week is Khartoum.
It's about controlling the message. The playbook is a playbook that many have used before. And it's essentially, how do we lock the message down? How do we strike fear in the hearts of people?
This culminates with the shutdown in social media. The junta knows that this is very ugly, what's going on now, and that a full depiction would be extremely harmful to the regime.
Much of what we know is from civilian journalists and cell phone videos and word of mouth, but journalists have not had the access that they need.
People dying on the street, hundreds missing and injured, but they still show music on TV. Business as usual. And this is exactly what used to happen during Bashir.
Sudanese activists hoped all of that was behind them. Almost 3 decades of Omar al-Bashir as president finally came to an end in mid-April, with his overthrow, arrest, and imprisonment. A temporary military government in place calling itself transitional, saying it was committed to handing over power to the people. But like Algeria to the northwest, where unrest brought down another longtime leader, toppling a president has proven easier than negotiating with men in uniforms.
Following the stepping down of Bashir in mid-April, and then the TMC, the Transitional Military Council, sort of saying, we're going to negotiate, we're going to have this sort of transition period, there was hope. I think a lot of people around the world were looking at Sudan as an example of, okay, maybe we've learned from the Arab Spring. Maybe this won't be Egypt or Libya or Syria. Maybe this will be a little bit different.
It became clear 2 or 3 weeks ago that the Transitional Military Council was not negotiating in good faith. Tensions began to rise. The 2-month-old sit-in had become the symbol of resistance and the uprising. And it became very clear last week that the Military Council was not going to permit this any longer.
Basically what happened is that they attacked protesters. They started shooting anybody that puts up a phone trying to film. Right? So a lot of people were shut down because of that. Their phones were stolen. And after that, of course, the slowing down of the internet in most telecom networks in Sudan, and eventually shutting it down.
By jamming internet networks, the military government choked information flows inside the country and to the outside world. Sudanese rely on messaging services like WhatsApp and social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube to organize politically and to get images and information out. The clampdown created a vacuum. Missing people could not be found, and no one knew just how many people had been killed by the RSF, the paramilitary rapid support forces. All of this took place under a transitional military council that, when it took power less than 2 months ago, made all the right noises. The appointment of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan as the head of the TMC was initially well received. Al-Burhan had previously met with protesters and appeared to be open to their views. The military council released hundreds of political prisoners, ended the curfew in Khartoum, and said it would work with the opposition Alliance for Change and Freedom. The TMC also made the kind of promises on media freedom that make headlines.
The military council sent a message to newspaper editors, basically lifting censorship, which after 3 decades was impressive to see the type of headlines and the type of coverage. Some outlets were not as quick to jump on that, like Sudan TV, but some of the outlets like Sudan 24 it had some very interesting coverage. You saw opposition leaders on TV. I think that was refreshing to see that type of press freedom being allowed in the country.
But once the Transitional Military Council decided, I believe, that they were going to crush the uprising, that led to an increase, a ratcheting up of pressure on journalists, expulsion of journalists, and restrictions of all sorts. As the Transitional Military Council moved closer and closer to the crackdown, they moved closer and closer to an entire shutdown of both international and domestic news coverage.
The coverage of the story in the international media has been restricted. Foreign reporters who had only recently been allowed back into the country after being banned in the dying days of the al-Bashir regime had their movements curtailed by the new military authorities. One of the most influential foreign news networks, Al Jazeera, is currently banned from reporting from Sudan. Its offices were raided, and it had its license to broadcast revoked on May 30th. The timing of the ban on Al Jazeera raised eyebrows. It happened just after TMC leaders met with the rulers of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. The Saudi-owned Al Arabiya, which competes against the Qatari-owned Al Jazeera across the Arabic-speaking world, has been far less critical of the TMC over the stalled transition process and continues to report from Khartoum. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE's support for the Sudanese junta is not limited to the airwaves. 10 days after al-Bashir was deposed, the Saudi and Emirati governments sent Sudan $3 billion worth of aid, including $500 million in cash reserves, which the Reuters news agency described as throwing a lifeline to the country's new military leaders.
That decision to shut down Al Jazeera and withdraw his license was not too surprising. After the 2 top heads of the military council, al-Burhan and Hamidti, paid their visits to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, that's when Al Jazeera's license was withdrawn. And there's widespread belief in Sudan that these governments are interfering to prevent the establishment of a full democracy in the country.
What's important to remember about Sudan is its geopolitical importance. But also, previously, Bashir didn't quite pick sides, right? Bashir kept Qatar and so on side, as well as the Saudis, by supporting the Saudi interest in Yemen. But the Transitional Military Council didn't quite feel the same way. And so by actively going to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and saying, you know what, we're on your side here, effectively, it then became, Al Jazeera is then a pawn in that game between Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
The Sudan story of 2019 has unfortunate echoes of 2011 and the Arab Spring. The sense of optimism and the prospects of a political transformation that proved fleeting. The ensuing clampdown that has been brutal. The alliance for freedom and change that has so far failed to live up to its name, and the space that seemed to be opening up for the news media, gone before they knew it, before they really had a chance to use it.
Sudan was always a dark spot for media. We never had independent media for the last 30 years and even before that. I think the military council is basically a more powerful extension of the old regime, a biased extension of the old regime. They need to clamp down on news because they only want their version of the news.
And so what you've got at the moment is a country, a city that has been divided up, that is unable to communicate to each other, let alone to people outside. A diaspora that is desperate to know what's going on in the country on the ground, and an international media that isn't quite sure what's going on. And so it essentially means that the TMC can kind of do what they want at the moment. And that's terrifying.